Today, you're going to begin your journey into front-end development. Oh, and hey, I'd like to mention this video's sponsor, Skillshare.com. Now, it's a brand new year here in 2019, and Skillshare will help keep you learning and thriving as they offer 25,000 different classes in coding, design, business, and more. For instance, you're about to watch my front-end development course, but you could follow up after by learning SAS at Skillshare. Skillshare is also super affordable with a subscription that only costs $10 a month, but if you're one of the first 500 of my subscribers to click the link below here in the description, you get the first 2 months free, so take advantage. Hey everyone, what's up? Gary Simon of Coursetro. So today I'm releasing this really big free crash course into front-end development. Now, just last week I released a UI design crash course where we spent all of our time in Adobe XD and I explained exactly how to design a user interface as a UI designer. Now today, this is kind of a follow-up course where we take that UI design mockup and we make it a reality in the browser as seen here using HTML, CSS, and a little bit of JavaScript. So I'm just showing you two side-by-side browser windows just to show you that it is responsive. And I'm going to approach this from the perspective that you are an absolute beginner. You've never touched HTML or CSS and JavaScript. And so the initial part of this course is going to be focused on maybe just a little bit of slides, maybe about 20 minutes worth, but it's really important so that you understand the conceptual elements of what HTML, CSS, and what it means to be a front-end developer essentially. And then next, after that, we're going to spend all of our time in the code editor making that project, the mock-up, a reality. All right. So if you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe. I have a ton more content coming this year, and let's go ahead and get started. All right. So welcome to the very first exciting slide, 2019 Front-End Developers Crash Course for beginners. And we're going to be implementing UI design. So first of all, what is front-end development? Well, front-end, or FE as the acronym is, uses web technology such as HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to implement UI design. So typically, you have a UI designer who will create the mockups for the different screens associated with the website or the app. They'll hand them off to you as the front-end developer to then take those mockups and make them a reality in the browser with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Now, sometimes as I advocate that you have two of these roles kind of mixed or combined. A lot of times if you're a freelancer, you may be doing both of those roles yourself, and I think it has a clear advantage and a benefit to you if you're a UI designer to understand HTML and CSS and vice versa. All right, so let's go ahead and continue on here. So first of all, let's talk about equipping yourself with code editors. All right, so there's a bunch of different code editors out there. Me personally, I like Visual Studio Code the most. It's free. It's from Microsoft. It has a lot of plugins and huge community, a lot of support. I used Sublime Text before this. There's other ones like Atom, Notepad++. There's Dreamweaver. There's so many options to choose from, but a lot of people these days are using Visual Studio Code, so you can use that as well. That's what I'm going to be using once we get to the project portion of this course. So let's talk about the very, very basics. And again, I'm aiming this at absolute beginners. So if you already know this stuff and you just want to get and fast forward to the part where we actually start, coding HTML, then go ahead and do that. So HTML, first and foremost, is an acronym for Hypertext Markup Language. All right, sounds scary, but it's not. So it's basically a language for building web pages. HTML elements allow you to define different areas of a web page. So let's take a look at what HTML actually looks like. So first we start with the tags. Now we're going to cover specifically the anatomy of HTML and the terminology and the lingo that goes with it. But when you start an HTML document, you start with the HTML tags and everything goes inside of there. So it's a container of sorts. Next we have the HTML head element. All right, so basically when it comes to the head element, it provides information or metadata about the HTML document itself. So let's take a look at what some of these other HTML elements that you find within the head element look like. So you have one called the title. So For instance, when you click on a web page and you see the document in the browser title right there, that's where it's coming from. It's in between those title tags right there. Another common one is to link up your CSS file that's associated with that HTML document, and we'll get to CSS in a bit. And then there's also other meta tags like meta description, which provides a description to the search engines like Google when they're listing out your results, and also meta keywords and other ones. There are other ones that exist in here, but don't worry about those for now. And so, yeah, common HTML elements, and the other tags include style, where you can write inline CSS or CSS inside the HTML document itself, and script tags as well for JavaScript. All right, so let's take a look at the body element. So if we have we start off with our HTML element, the head, and then underneath that goes the body element with our opening and closing body tags. So the body element defines the main content of the web page, and it's basically the viewable, the visible part of the web page that people will see. So when it comes to the elements that are found within the head section of your HTML document, that's nothing that they see on the actual screen. That's all defined within the body tag. All right, so let's talk about HTML closing elements versus what are called singletons right here. So this would be an example of a closing HTML element. It starts off right here. It opens up with an opening tag. By the way, this is called a tag. And it starts with a less than, and then the tag name, and then a closing. So this would be a paragraph tag, and it's just simply P. And you can put your paragraph text inside of here. And then the closing tag is right here. This right here, this whole thing is called an HTML element in and of itself. So it's important to understand. It's useful to know the terminology. So this is a closing element, essentially. Next up, these are what are called singletons. And I really didn't know that until recently, the terminology of these. But you notice that, like for BR, that's for putting a new line break, basically, in your HTML document between text. That does not have a closing tag, as you could see. It's self-contained, or it's self-closing, as it's sometimes referred to as being. And there are other ones as well. So let's take a look at HTML attributes. So an example right here. So we just saw the image tag, which, by the way, is a singleton because it's self-closing. We can see here we have two different HTML attributes. We have this one right here, and then we have another one right here. And they're structured so that the attribute starts with a property name equals, and then it's bound to a value right here. So this is linking to an image, and then the alt tag is required, and a required attribute on the image element, and it just provides information about the graphic that's being shown. And this doesn't get shown in the browser really unless you hover over the graphic, and it'll provide you with information. But it's also even more useful for people, for instance, who are using screen readers. All right. That showed up after the fact. Okay. So let's talk about class and ID attributes. So here's an example of what these look like. Again, it follows the same format as all the other attributes, but these in particular I thought I would mention because there's a lot of different type of attributes, but you see these ones a lot, and they can be basically placed on any HTML element. In this case, it's a paragraph tag. And the class attribute is most commonly used to point to a style in CSS, so it will allow the CSS to use it as what's called a selector, which we'll get to later on, to provide style to it. And then the ID attribute is most commonly used for JavaScript, and we'll get to that a little bit later as well. All right, and by the way, both of these can be used in CSS and JavaScript, so you can reference IDs in CSS as well, although it's not common anymore. So let's talk about the div element. So the div element is normally used as a container for other elements. And again, there's a lot of HTML elements that I'm not mentioning, but just as with the previous slide, I wanted to mention this because you see it very often in your HTML. And so it's normally used for defining different layouts and different visual properties of the layout through CSS. So that's just something to keep in mind. All right, so let's also talk about what semantic elements are. So an example of these semantic tags would be form, for instance, header, and section. And these all just, you use these when you're writing your HTML to write semantic HTML. It's basically about language. There's also non-semantic elements such as div and span, because they don't really tell you about what the section is being defined. Again, understanding this isn't 100% vital if you're just starting out, but it does help because you see this terminology in different tutorials and perhaps other front-end developers as well. HTML validation is very important. So there's a right and wrong way to write HTML elements. There's an online tool, and there's a bunch of them. This one is a popular one, validator.w3.org. And the only thing about this is your project has to be online and available online somewhere. Otherwise, if you're just starting out and you're in your development environment on your computer and it's not yet online, you haven't uploaded the files to a server or whatever, then there are extensions that you can use from modern code editors for Visual Studio Code, for instance, and the other ones as well. And so I'll be using one of those. So while we're typing our HTML, it's going to let us know if we screwed something up, like if we left out an attribute that's normally required. All right, so if you're confused, just understand at this point that there's many HTML elements and attributes, and each has a distinct purpose and Google based on your needs. All right, so when you're going to write your first HTML document, you may have a question, okay, what is the HTML element or the tag name used for displaying video? Just go to Google, type in HTML video tag, and trust me, you're going to come up with a bunch of results. W3schools.com will probably be one of those results, and it will provide you with what it is, both how to use it, and along with any other attributes that you can use along with it. So now let's talk about CSS. So it's an acronym for Cascading Style Sheets, and it's a language for providing style to your HTML elements. And it could be defined inside of an HTML document that says element. I should fix that, with the style tag, or in a separate CSS file itself, which is what we're going to do, because when you start writing out a lot of CSS, you don't want that cluttering up your HTML document. So what does CSS look like? There it is. Very exciting stuff. Not really. It's actually very simple. So let's break it down. First, and we're going to go through a bunch of terminology right here, and it's very useful to understand the terminology and to use these words correctly and not be confused when another front-end developer friend starts talking about things, telling you to do things, and you don't know what they're talking about. So here's the basic terminology for all of this. Right here, we have two different rule sets. So this is a rule set, as well as this, okay? Next up are selectors. So when you start writing a rule set, you start off by a selector. Now, a selector can be an HTML element itself, like the body, which is the biggest HTML element where you start off for the visible, reviewable portion of a web page, or a paragraph, in this case down here, or it could be the IMG for image tag. So there's those type of selectors. There are also the selectors of the class selector, which you start off by writing a period. The period or the dot means class, and then the name that you gave the class. Or if you're going to reference an ID, you can do that as well with a hashtag, the number sign, plus the name of the ID you gave it. So those are selectors. Next, we have the declarations. So we open up the rule set with these squiggly braces or the brackets right here, and inside goes what are called the declarations. In this case, we have two declarations. This right here and this right here. And then in this rule sets case, it's only one declaration. So some rule sets can have like 20 different declarations. Then we have inside of the declaration, it's two different parts. You have the CSS property name followed by a colon. And then you also have the CSS value associated with that property. And it's the value, and then you end the declaration with a semicolon. All right. Let's talk about CSS units. And they provide CSS provides you with absolute and relative units to define lengths, basically. And length will obviously be very important when you're structuring a layout. Expressed by a number value plus the unit. So an example of this would be the property of font size with a value of 30 and then the unit of pixels, which is an absolute unit. So let's talk about CSS Absolute Units. So they're fixed units, thus absolute, and thus will not change between different screen sizes unless you're using media queries. And I'm going to get into media queries in a second. So common, these absolute common units here would be centimeters, as in cm, millimeters, inches, pixels, points, or picas, which I've never used once in my life. And then we have CSS Relative Units. All right, now relative units are relative to another property. Thus, they will not change between different screens. They will change between different screens automatically. So when I say different screens, for instance, if you've ever been on your desktop and you have your window, open up your browser, and you go to maybe enlarge that window by left-clicking and dragging the edge of the browser out, you'll see that on some websites, the size of the type, for instance, the text will get large, or the images will grow and get large. Those are done with relative units. Examples of these are the percentage, which is the most used, I would say, of relative units. EM and REM as well. These are specific to typography units and scaling up your type. You have VW and VH for viewport width and height, as well as viewport minimum and maximum. All right. Some other just interesting CSS things that you should know as a beginner. CSS has multiple selectors. So if you have a rule set and you have multiple HTML elements that should be styled with the same declarations, you can just add them with a comma right there. So you can apply the same rule set to multiple selectors. Also, CSS has functions. There's about 10 or 11 of them or so. Here's just an example of 2 of them being used as property values. That's where they're placed at, and it's always the function name opened up by parentheses, and then depending on how many parameters they accept, you just separate those by comma. So this would be suitable for a background color where you're using red, green, blue values along with an alpha value, which means you can make it transparent. You could also do math for properties. So if you're trying to make the margin, which is dealing with white space on a UI design, you can use the calc function, and you can do division, multiplication, all the 4 primary math functions that you can add in there. CSS also has animations, which we're going to implement in a very simple manner with our document. And they allow you to animate these HTML elements through both the animation property and the transition property. So the animation property, along with keyframes, allows you to create more complex animations. So if you define an animation that's 10 seconds long, you can use keyframes and control the values of different properties in terms of the percentage between that occurs for that 10-second duration. It's a little hard to explain without showing you, so I will show you an example of this when we get to the project. And then the transition property is more simplistic. It simply allows you to transition between 2 different CSS values. CSS media queries, this is a very important one, and we're going to get into because we're going to make our design responsive. So media queries allow you to define different rule sets for different screen sizes, and this is referred to as responsive design, responsive CSS, or responsive web design, RWD as it's called. And it allows a page to adapt accordingly to varying screen sizes. And this is an example of what a media query looks like. So you define it up here, and you use something like min width or max width, and you give it a value of maybe something like 650 pixels, and then you put in your rule sets here where you can either add remove or define new rule sets or overwrite rule sets that were written outside of here to change them based on the width of the screen. So just as a side note, back when I started learning CSS and web development in general in like late 90s, early 2000s, we didn't have responsive design because we didn't need it. When people used web pages, they only used it through the context of a monitor, these big bulky computer monitors, the CRTs as they're called, or their laptop. And so the screen sizes were all pretty much the same in terms of size. But then once the iPhone came out and people had devices, small devices that were in portrait mode that they could hold in their hand, when they visited web pages, it was hard to use them because the web page would just automatically shrink down and it was hard to use them. You had to zoom in, and still to this day, there are still some web pages that are out there that are older, or maybe they're built by old school dudes who never learned media queries and responsive design, and it's a pain in the butt to use those web pages. So that's the purpose of these media queries, essentially. Next, we'll talk about very briefly about JavaScript. So before I get into JavaScript, some pros might be like, what are you talking about? You're done talking about HTML and CSS. There's so many other aspects. Of course there are, but I really only wanted to touch on the absolute beginner fundamentals, which is what I just did. Of course, there's going to be more intermediate to advanced concepts, but I'm not going to bog down a beginner with all that stuff. What I just told you is probably going to get you by, and most people, very far as a conceptual level understanding goes. So JavaScript itself, it's a scripting language for implementing features like user interface interactivity, animations, 2D, 3D graphics, stuff like image carousels, and more. So when I mean UI interactivity, so in the context of the example that we're about to start coding, when you're using it on a smartphone and you see the little hamburger icon menu that you see up there, the 3 lines that are stacked vertically on each other, when you touch that, you have a menu that's displayed somewhere on the user interface automatically. That's done with the help of JavaScript. So there's 3 different layers when it comes to building web pages as a front-end developer. And so first is HTML, next is CSS. You need to understand those things pretty much together. And then once you have a solid understanding of those 2 things, then you can start learning JavaScript. It can also be written in an HTML document with a style, with the script tag. Look at me screwing this up. Or inside an external JavaScript file. Now, also as an aside, modern front-end development frameworks like libraries and libraries like React, Vue, and Angular, they are written with JavaScript. And I only decided to mention this because chances are, if you're itching to get into web development, maybe you've been researching it a little bit and you've heard of these things called like React or Vue or Angular, just understand that those are written on top of JavaScript, and you should not be touching those if you're a beginner. All right, so like I mentioned before, if you're interested in front-end development, you first start with your HTML, your CSS. Then you get into understanding JavaScript itself. Sometimes that's referred to as a vanilla JavaScript, just plain old JavaScript. Then once you have a good, solid understanding of the basics and fundamentals as it pertains to JavaScript, then you can get into React, Vue, and Angular. I'm not going to be getting into too much JavaScript here, only because I'm going to be putting out a free course on an introduction to JavaScript very shortly. So that's why you need to subscribe up if you haven't yet and click that bell notification icon. All right, so now we're ready to rock, and that ends the boring slide portion. So now we're going to give some context to this theory that we've been going over, and things are going to start like making a lot more sense as we actually start doing. All right, so let's get started. All right, so the very, very, very first step that we need to start with is to first create a folder on our computer. So you could be on Mac, you could be on Linux, you could be on Windows, whatever, it doesn't matter. Hopefully you know how to create a folder. If you don't, you need to probably not watch this course anymore and get some basic computer skills first. But I'm going to create the folder right now using the command line, and I'm just using a console console emulator called Commander, and it's free, but whatever. And I'm just going to go into my code folder and then type in make dir, mkdir, which is the command for creating a folder, and I'm going to call it Frontender. I don't know. That's just what I literally came up on the top of my head right now. We're also going to, after it's created, we're going to put double ampersands for and. Afterwards, after it's created, we're going to cd, or we're going to jump into that folder, and that's going to be Frontender. All right, so now we're in there, and at this point, I want you to, if you're brand new to this and you don't already have a code editor, go to Google, type Visual Studio Code, download it, install it. Then you can relaunch your console if you're going to do it this way, and then open up your code editor, your Visual Studio Code, and that's going to type in code period inside of the current directory, and that will launch. It's launching on my different monitor over here. Let me get it over here. I have to update it apparently. It'll launch Visual Studio Code in this brand new empty folder right here, Frontender. All right, so this is what the code editor looks like. A little scary if you're new to it. Don't worry about that. Right here is new file. That's what we want to click. We're going to create one called index.html. And index right here is an important name because most web servers recognize this as being basically the starting page for a given folder. All right, so index.html. Okay, so this is, once we create it, this is where we're going to start writing out our HTML. All right, so first let me get rid of that. And you can also notice that there's something different that maybe you don't see. Mine, it shows my index.html with a number 3 by the side. But if I go to view and I go to my problems, we could see I have this validator extension that I've installed already. So if you don't see this, that's the reason. There's an extension that you can install for your validator for these things to show, and it's already given me issues saying certain things aren't in here that need to be in here in terms of the HTML document itself. So if you want access to install this plugin, you just click over here, the extensions, and you type in W3C, and then the one I have installed is right here. You can see it doesn't have the install because I already have it installed. So just click install and go through the steps, and it's very easy to install it. And you'll have to reload your Visual Studio Code app, and it'll reload it for you, and you'll be ready to go with it. And so you want to go to view and then problems to get this little indicator down here. Me, for the purpose of writing the code and having as much space as possible so you can see what I'm writing, I'm not going to show it. But again, it's a good thing if you're starting out to have that there. All right, so what we're going to do now is just go back here to our document and let's get started. So I'm going to take a little bit of a shortcut here. And by the way, if you want to change the size and the scale of your type and the UI itself, you can hit Control key plus the plus sign to make it bigger, or the minus sign to make it smaller. So for now, I'm just going to make it big so I want to make sure you can see everything. So if we can do a shortcut to get some of the boilerplate or the initial HTML written out of the way, because it's a little bit cumbersome and annoying to have to write out all these initial CSS or HTML tags every time you want to write HTML. So if I just hit the exclamation point and hit enter, we see that it's going to give us all this HTML. One side tip or side note, to save space on my screen, I can hit Control B to get rid of that sidebar, and then Control B to bring it back. So I will be doing that periodically. All right, so here we're going to see some things that you probably aren't familiar with. I lied earlier. One of the first starting tags that you want is your doc type, which is just defining it as HTML. You don't ever have to touch this or worry about it. And then we have our HTML tag right here. It has an attribute called lang, which we're setting as English. You can see that the HTML tag, it starts right up here and it closes way down there at the very bottom. Everything else is contained inside of it. So next up, as I mentioned before, we have our head tags, and we have some of those meta elements that I mentioned before. You don't have to worry about these. Don't even worry about them. Don't let them confuse you right now. Just forget about them. The ones that you can really worry about at this point in time are the title. Notice it just says document. And then also, we're going to link up our CSS document, which doesn't yet exist, but we're going to link it up right here. We use the link element or the link tag We're going to hit enter. And this, when it comes to Visual Studio Code, you don't have to hand type everything, which is pretty handy. I could sit there typing it out by hand like this, which is probably good to understand initially. Sorry, my phone's going off. But really, if I just type link, the name of the element, hit enter, it's going to fill in some of the default attributes for us. And notice we have an attribute called href. This is where you specify the location and the name of your CSS document that pertains to this HTML document here. So I think we'll put it in a folder called CSS. And then inside of the folder, we'll have a file called main.css. Some people call it style.css, whatever, it's up to you. There we go, and that's good with that. Let's also change this. We'll change it in a little bit. I just wanted to show you what this title element does in a second. Let's get Control B to get back this section over here, this panel, and let's create that folder. So this right here is the folder icon. We're going to call it CSS. And then inside of it, it automatically selects it, by the way. And then we can create a new file inside of it called main.css. So this is where all of our CSS is going to go. But first, we're going to focus on writing the HTML. So I'm going to close that out. OK. Now, right now, if I wanted to preview what this HTML document looked like in the browser, there's a couple ways I can go about it. I can right-click on the HTML document itself, and I can just do Reveal in Explorer. And if I bring this up, I double click on index.exe. Let me get it on my monitor over here. This is what the HTML document at this point in time basically looks like. Let me save it, by the way, which is what that little circle is. It means it hasn't been saved yet. So if we save it and refresh it, we will now see at the top, it says document. And that's what's defined in those title tags. So if I save this or update this to Frontend Dev Course, now if I save this, come back and refresh, we see it's there. But this is Google Chrome. That's my default browser, by the way. You can right-click in it and view page source. Firefox has something similar, so does Internet Explorer. View page source, by the way, will show you all the HTML that's in there currently. Also, you can hit Control-Shift-I here in Chrome, and you can get some other tools. You can see the elements themselves and any associated CSS with them. We'll get into that maybe a little bit later, though. One thing, though, like I mentioned, there's a couple ways to view your HTML as you're developing and working. The way I just showed you is annoying because every time you make a change here, you have to refresh the browser. Doesn't sound like a lot of work, but it becomes a very annoying, tedious pain in the butt, especially when you're dealing with the CSS and you're trying to look at minute changes that you're making to have to refresh 1,000 times or hit your F5 refresh key. Instead of doing that, we can use an extension. Right-click and we choose Open with Live Server. I believe that's an extension you have to install. Yep, it is. And it's called Live Server. It's right there. I have it installed already. Same thing, install it, reload, and come back. And when we do this, open with Live Server, you'll see down there it says starting, and then it's telling me there's an error on my port that I've set up because I have it running on a different Visual Studio Code window I have open on another monitor. Let me just retry that again. You can also right-click here, like I mentioned, open with Live Server, or just hit Go Live. So this time it will work. It will pop your default browser with it in here. So what's cool about this is if I notice there's nothing in the page right now. If I just type that in the body tag and I bring it back over, I didn't have to refresh. It automatically refreshed when I saved the file. It does this for CSS as well. Very, very handy stuff. Okay. So let's move on with the next part, the next section of this course here, which is writing the actual HTML. All right, I lied. Before we get to writing the HTML, I have to mention this part. And so this is the UI design that we did in the free UI design course that I released a week or so ago. And this is what we're going to try to make a reality in the browser through HTML and CSS. Notice that we have our desktop version here and also a mobile version of it as well. Now we're going to do what's called mobile first CSS. And really, we don't have to worry about that part until we get to the CSS. But I just wanted to mention it first and foremost. And also, before we get to the CSS, we have certain assets here, like this vector graphic that we created, the two people down here, these icons right here, the white icons. I've made all these files available so you don't have to sit here exporting these within Adobe XD. So just download that wherever that is in my YouTube description. And then I want you to take all those files that are in the image folder and then create an images folder inside of here. We're going to call this images, and then drag all of those images over. And I'm going to get those images real quick myself. So I'm just going to right click. Actually, I don't even think I have to right click, and just drag them right there into images. And there we go. These are all the images that we're going to use here. All right. So now let's get started with writing our HTML. Now, the first thing you have to ask yourself when you're starting to write within your HTML tags here, within the body tag, is what do I need? You know, what are the needs of the user interface that I'm about to design? So you're going to be always going back and forth, and maybe if you have a second monitor, you'll have this up on the side between your UI element and seeing, you know, where are we starting? So start from the top left, basically. And maybe before starting that, ask yourself if you want a fluid design where the entire user interface will always be scaled to the very left, from the very left of the browser to the very right of the browser, or are we going to even at a different screen size, are we ever going to want to make the browser to kind of stay inside of a single block like this? So if that's the case, and it is our case, because when this gets at even larger viewports, like really big 4K monitors, I don't want it to extend all the way out when it comes to this primary content, like the type-based content right here, because we don't have much content really. So I'm going to confine it within a container. So we're going to add a div element right there. So I just type div and enter to get that there. And I'm going to give it a class because I'm going to want to style this element in CSS in order to tell it, you know, how much of the width of the browser or the viewport, as it's called, should it take up. So the div, I'm going to give a class, and I'm just going to call it container, which is a common class name for such an element for a layout. All right, so next up after that, let's go back to our UI. What do we have next? We have this logo right here, right? Now, by the way, as a side note, when I exported this right here is editable type. It hasn't been converted to outlines, which I think you would need to do with something like Adobe Illustrator or another vector application. So because I exported this as just, you know, an unflattened type right here, you're going to have the user will have to have the font Montserrat in order for this to load in the SVG. You normally would not want to do that, but I'm not really too concerned just for the purposes of this tutorial. So we have this already exported in our images folder. And how do we display an image in HTML? Well, we use that IMG element. All right. So we're going to come out there. And another thing you have to ask yourself, do you want the image to be clickable? For instance, we went on our web page and you want to get to the home page, you might click on the logo. You would use an A tag or an A element for that. And we're not going to do that. We have a home button here already. It's probably good to do that just as a general, just because people usually expect it. I'm just going to leave that off though, so keep things simple right now. So I'm just going to type the name of the tag, which is image. And by the way, you ask yourself, how did you know it's images? Well, it's because I've been doing this for so long. You will too, once you start getting the muscle memory down, you keep sticking with it and doing, you know, HTML and writing your HTML. If you didn't know, just go to Google, type how to display an image in HTML or HTML image tag. It'll let you know. So as you see, it puts the necessary attributes for when we use this code completion feature in Visual Studio Code. So the source is going to point to our images folder, our logo.svg. SVG is scalable vector graphics, and it's vector graphics as opposed to rastered graphics, and it's almost always better to use vector as opposed to like a JPEG or a PNG for these types of elements, like a logo. So I'm going to put in images /logo.svg. Now notice our alt, we could just put the company name 23 and 4. I think that was the name of it. Logo, something like that. And then we also have to ask ourselves if we want to be able to style this as a selector in CSS. Why would we want to style an image, you may be asking yourself? Well, if we want to move it around, like through margin and padding, and we want to control the size of it, because SVG files you can make real large or real small without the quality loss, we can give it a class. So a class, we're going to call it logo, something that makes sense. All right. After that, what is next? Well, we come out here and we see a navigation. In this case, on the desktop version, we have just 4 links, but on the mobile version, we have this hamburger icon menu. So we're going to have to account for both of these as it pertains to the HTML elements that we're about to write. All right. So when you look at these, by the way, you'll see, what are these? This is kind of like a list, right? It's an unordered list, which is an HTML element represented by the UL tag. So don't worry if it's a little bit confusing, don't worry too much. Before we write that UL tag though, I remember when I mentioned I was discussing HTML semantic tags. Well, one of them that would make sense to use here is what's called the nav tag. So we simply just wrap everything that comprises our navigation inside of this nav tag right here. Do you have to do it? No, but it's a good practice to do so. All right, so after this, we're going to have, we're going to put in our unordered list. So we'll say UL. All right, we want to be able to control it through CSS, so we're going to give it a class. Now, one thing to note when it comes to the CSS, I figure I just mention this right now real quickly, is if you only knew you're going to have one unordered list tag in your HTML document, then you wouldn't have to give it a class, because the selector then would be just UL. And that would be okay to do. But if you had multiple unordered lists, or if in the future your document might change to where you might have multiple unordered lists, then if you want to style them differently from each other, then you need to give them a class to differentiate them between them. That's just a different way to give them 2 different selectors. So we'll say class, and this one, for the class of this, the only thing that we need to reference for this particular HTML element is I'm going to give them kind of generic class names of show desktop and hide desktop. All right, so you might be wondering to yourself, why would we do that? Well, for this element up here, which is what we're designing for right now, we're going to create through a CSS rule set that will show this only for desktops, and it will hide it if it's on a viewport like on a phone. All right, and so we'll be doing the same thing with this icon as well. And in fact, because we're going to be doing CSS, mobile first CSS, we're going to put this actually above it in terms of the HTML. You don't necessarily have to do this, but I want to put it up here just because we're starting first with mobile HTML or CS, mobile first CSS. So what this is going to look like is I'm going to wrap this in an A tag as it's clickable, and I'm going to put href right here, going to nowhere, and so a hashtag for the href location. For instance, if you had multiple HTML documents, like another subpage, like services, this is where you would put that to direct the user to another HTML document. But if you don't have one, you can just do this, and then we can put class equals hide desktop. So notice we're using the same class name right here and here, because once we get to a desktop viewport resolution width, we're going to hide that hamburger icon menu because we don't need it anymore. Inside of here, we're going to put in, inside of this closing tag, by the way, as it's called, we're going to put in our image. Now, I have an image that I created in our images folder called ham, as in hamburger, right there, ham.svg. The alt will be maybe something like toggle menu. All right. And also, do we need any other attributes in here? Well, we actually need a few. So we're going to put class equals menu. That will allow us to position this icon menu, as well as an ID of menu as well for JavaScript, so that when a person clicks on it, we can attach a different class with it through JavaScript. If you're confused, don't worry too much about that in this point in time. Now, also for our unordered list right here, we're going to add an ID as well, because we're going to have to reference that with JavaScript later on. But don't worry about what is happening there in that regard at this moment in time. You'll see how this starts to come into play along with this near the end of the course. So the way an unordered list works is you open it up with the UL element, unordered list element, and inside of it, it accepts other different elements such as the LI, the list items. And so you'll have multiple list items, and this is what gives you your bullet point looks in the browser. And in fact, I'm going to show the browser right here on the right side just to give us an idea of what things are looking like as we start to write this HTML. And so this is what our HTML looks like so far. It's not very impressive, clearly. But what we want to do is, if you're using Chrome, we'll hit Control-Shift-I, and when you see this icon right here, it says toggle the device toolbar. If we choose this, we'll see it changes the look of it. And notice it says iPad Pro. We can change this to an iPhone X, for instance, and it'll give us the perspective of what this looks like in an iPhone, for instance. So that's one way to do it, to look at it like this way. But because I really want to shrink this this navigation as much as possible, what we can do actually is we can take this and scale it like that, but it's still showing a little bit too much of this area. So what I'm going to do instead, just for the purposes of this tutorial, I'm going to toggle this out, and you can still simulate the same thing just by dragging in the side of the browser. So I'm going to put this permanently, at least for a while, up over here, so we can get an idea of what it looks like on a mobile viewport as it stands right here. So then what I'll simply do is I'm going to change up my size a little bit, and I will bring this down a bit and get things situated up just a bit. All right, and right here looks good. I hit Control-B just so we can see more of what's happening. Yeah, I think that'll be good right around here. All right, so as we save, this is going to automatically reload. Okay, so we can see we have our 26:4 logo right here. We have this toggle menu that is showing. The one thing I think we're going to have to change here is this right here. This wasn't showing up. Images/ham.svg. There we go. Now it's showing up as it's supposed to. Now notice showing up underneath the logo as opposed to the right. When it comes to just HTML without CSS, that's how things are going to stack on top of each other. It's going to look real bad for a while until we get to the CSS portion. So let's do this UL class right here for the unordered list. So the way this works is we put in LI. All right, so we have a list item. And then if I just do this, let's put in whatever and save it, you'll see over here just above me, we have our first list item. So this is actually going to serve as our navigation. So if I hit A, because we want our navigations to be links, and the way you create links that are clickable is use the A tag right here. And it's an opening and closing tag that you'll notice. And we'll put in for a location. We don't have like a location, so we're just going to put in the hash tag right there. And then we have inside of it the anchor text. And so if we type in home, for instance, that would be our first link. You'll see it's now a clickable link that we can access. So a real handy way of replicating lines of code in Visual Studio Code is hit the Shift, Alt, and the down arrow key as many times as you need it. So now we can change this up. The next one is services from our mockup, about, and contact. All right. We didn't need this one, but we do want one more element, list item element at the top. And what this is going to be is when somebody clicks on this icon right here, it's going to display this navigation, this navigation as we have right here. And there's going to be an X icon, an exit, to exit out and close out that navigation drawer that's been opened. And so we're going to need a list item for that specifically. All right, and so if some of the stuff is not making sense to you, that's expected. You'll see how it all comes full circle as we do the CSS and then JavaScript. I can't iterate that enough. So inside of this first one, for the exit icon, I'm going to put in an image, and the image, we don't need this within a link because it's not taken to another page. So we're going to put an image tag, so img. The source is going to be images/exit.svg. This is something that I actually didn't design in the mockup. If we look at the mockup over here, we'll see there was nowhere that I put it like an exit. I didn't even really draw or design what the navigation drawer looks like. That's something that normally would be handled by the designer, but I just wanted to put that disclaimer in there. But it's just a simple X is all it is, an SVG graphic. The alt, we're just going to say exit menu. All right. And we're going to need an ID attached to this because we're going to use JavaScript to detect when somebody clicks on this exit button. And I automatically add a CSS class that will hide it, basically, along with the rest of the menu. So the ID is going to be exit. We're going to give it a class so that we can style it specifically, called exit-btn, and then hide desktop. So we're going to hide this button during desktop, basically, when they're in desktop mode, because that's not going to need to be shown when we're in the large desktop. So that looks pretty good to me right there. All right, so that's our navigation. Let's save this. And this is what it looks like. So the importance of CSS can't be stressed enough, but let's continue on. One element that I did forget to put in, another semantic element, is right here, right after the opening container div, right here. This is all what I would consider header information, so I'm going to put header right here, and we're going to end it just before our closing div tag, which is right here. So we close this out right there. And just to get everything kind of indented up, there we go. You can see how, by the way, we indent lines to make things a little bit more easier to read. Another thing to do is if you want to collapse certain areas that you don't want to see, you can hover over here and then just click on that minus button. And now all the stuff inside of header is now closed out if you need to try to find or scan areas of your HTML that are harder to find. All right, so that's good right there. Okay, next what we're going to do is focus on what comes next. So if we open up our XD, next we have this illustration. All right, so with this vector, we have a headline and a subheadline. All right, so let's go ahead and work on that stuff. So just after the closing header tag, we're going to put in a section semantic element, because this will define a primary section of our document, and this right here is what's usually referred to as a hero section. All right, so inside of there, we the first element that shows up is that image, that SVG graphic. So image source equals images server.svg. The alt, I'm just going to put in server graphic or illustration, whatever, and we'll give it a class to style in the future and to position it correctly as server. So notice how big it shows up by default in this browser. All right. Next up after this, we're going to have in, let's expand this a little bit. After our image, we're going to have another HTML element that you haven't been exposed to yet, which is the H1 through H6 headlines. So what that means is when you have important areas of your web page in terms of the typographic elements, whenever you have like a headline of an important area of your page, then or text specifically, then you can put it inside these H1 tags right here. Normally you don't split them on different lines, so you can just put in the name of what you want, like web hosting for the modern era, and there you go. You can see it's right down there. Of course, it's not using the font that we want, but you'll see that we can change that as well going forward here momentarily. Okay, and by the way, these are not headlines. They're technically called heading tags. All right, so after that we have what comes next. We'll see that we have a subheadline. So I'll just copy this text right here. And this time we're going to simply use a paragraph element. You saw that earlier. So if we put P, we're going to give it a class because I want to be able to reference it of subhead. And again, these names, you can come up with them on your own. So there isn't something technically called subhead. I'm just giving it that name. We're going to paste this in. So this is what our HTML looks like so far. And then we will put in another image element, which doesn't show up here because if you followed along during the UI design course that I did, or the responsive part, which is like part 2 of the series, I decided not to have the little scrollable area, which we do have over here. Because on a smartphone, you're going to see there's just clearly information that you can scroll, but on the desktop version, you may not see this bottom portion. So this is going to be an animated scroll icon that kind of gives the user a hint that they should scroll down. So to do that, again, it's an image, so we're going to use the image tag again. Images/scroll.svg. The alt will just be scroll down. And a class, we're going to give it a couple classes. So class equals scroll. That's just how we're going to style it and position that and size that icon correctly. And then we're going to use our hide on mobile because we don't want it to show on mobile, and then show on desktop. All right, great. So as you see, we can have multiple classes, as many as we want, which cannot be said about the ID attribute. All right, so after that section, and that's enough of that section right there, so we're done with that. And by the way, it's what it looks like when we update it. Not sure if I'm showing up on top of it or not. But so let's look at what we have next. Next, we have this interesting area right here with this graphic that kind of does this nice little sort of Bezier curves and rounded edges, inverted and such. And then we have, so this is a container itself. It's a block of sorts. And then we have these things inside. So, but let's first try to figure out how we're going to do this. Now, initially when I designed this, I thought to myself, we're going to take an SVG and we'll export it and we'll get this in there through some clever CSS. But I decided against that because this shape is simple enough to where I can actually achieve it through CSS alone. And it's minimal. It's not too hard, but I'll describe it when we get to that point. For now, our container is just going to look like this, a straight, flat container, which is fine if you chose to go that route, by the way. But we are going to integrate this in the CSS portion. So for now, we want to get this. All right. So to do that, the next area we're going to have is a div. Actually, no. Let's close this out. So this closing div tag is in relation to this div class container right here. All right. And the reason I'm going outside of it is because if we refer back to this, we can see, especially on this version, we could see that the container element that we just had, the very first element in our body, is basically going to be structured like this. All right, we're going to give it on a desktop a width of like 80% or so and center it like it is. However, we could see that this blue part extends all the way outside of that container. So that's why I closed that container div and we put in a section right here. So div, and we're going to put in class. We're just going to call it blue-container. Makes sense to me. And then we're going to put in and reuse our div class container because inside of it we do have content that we want to align with the rest of the page, like this, right in there. All right. And all right, so also notice that if we save this, we don't see anything because div classes in and of themselves, or div elements, nothing happens unless you apply CSS to it. So there's nothing occurring here that you would see. So inside of it, like I said, we want to have that div container class. So we're going to put another div. Class is container. All right, and then inside of that, we're going to go ahead and put in the next elements which show up after that would be these. So we have what's occurring here essentially is a list of icons and descriptions, right? So if it's a list and it's not ordered from 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, because there is something called an ordered list, which would give you numbers. But we want an unordered list similar to our navigation over here. So we're going to use the UL and LI elements. So inside of there, we're just going to put UL. And also one thing I haven't mentioned yet, which we'll get to in the CSS, but I do want to mention it now. On this UL element, I'm not going to give it a class because we can use a selector such as blue container as a class space UL in order to reference just this class specifically. You'll see more of what I mean going forward. But so if that's confusing, don't worry. Then we're going to put an LI element, and inside of here, what do we have for each list item? Well, we have an icon, which is an image, and then a paragraph. So we're going to put our image. The source is images/icon-1.svg as it's named. And then we'll just call this, I don't know, calendar icon. And then we have that paragraph. And I'll just go grab that text real quick. And then just paste it in like that. So if we save it, you probably won't see it. If I hide myself with my software, there I go, bye-bye. You'll see what it looks like. You're seeing a big space here because the icon itself is white and it's on a white background, but it's showing up right there. Not important to see at this point though. So bringing myself back, if I can do that quick enough, there we are. We'll go ahead and continue on, and all we'll do is just take this, copy it, and we'll paste it. Sometimes the formatting will get screwed up when we do that. So I just take these 3 lines, we'll shift tab, and it fixes it up, and we'll do this one more time. And notice, I want you to notice something. Sometimes when it comes to the HTML I'm writing, I'm keeping everything on one line. For instance, we have this list item, this opening list item tag right there, and then the closing's on this, and then we have another element right here. It doesn't really matter. You can put it on separate lines like this if you want, or not. It's all completely up to you in how you want to read the HTML. It doesn't affect the actual HTML document itself. All right, so for when it comes to multiple elements, HTML elements being nested in a different container, it's nicer to have them spread out in multiple lines just for readability purposes. So we'll take this and make this 2 and 3, and you can adjust these alt attribute values if you want on your own. I'm just going to leave them here just so we can save a little bit of time. So now we have 3 of these. And don't worry, we're getting close to the end of the HTML section. We still have another couple sections to go, so let's knock that out. Underneath that, we have this testimonial section, and there's a very light gray background right here, container on it. So that's going to be the first element that we have to create. And again, this element will extend all the way to the right and left of the viewport. So we're going to have to exit out of these closing these div tags from the container element and the blue container element class as well. So, and sort of do the same thing right here. So we can see we have our 2 closing div tags, which is in respect to our blue container and div class container right here. And then just to save a little bit of time, I'm going to take those 2, paste them, and I'll just call this gray hyphen container. And then we're giving red squiggly lines because I haven't closed the tags. So if I just hit this, and enter, it'll automatically close those out for me, just like that. All right, so then we have to ask ourselves, what is next? What type of content is inside of there? Well, we have 2 different list items. All right, or right here and here and there. So they're unordered list items. So we're going to use the UL LI once again. All right, so when it comes to being semantic and using the right tags, when it comes to showing, for instance, a quote with an author and maybe an avatar or an image of the author, there are some semantic tags that we can use for this. All right, inside of the list items here themselves. All right, so for this, the first one, I'm just going to use image. Source equals images or / user1.png. The alt is something like user testimonial picture will be fine. After that, we're going to have a block quote. Oh, and by the way, I kind of skipped an element. That semantic element would be figure that we're going to use. And we're going to wrap it around everything. All right, we'll indent these two real quick. And then the block quote is basically what the person's saying, which would be right there. It's just more lorem ipsum text. And then after that, we're going to use fig caption, which is an HTML element that goes along with figure that you can use inside. So fig caption, and inside of here we can just put the user's name or Jane Doe, whatever, something like that. And then we'll simply copy this, all of that, and then paste it. Just like that. This will be user 2. This will be John Doe. We'll save it. Once again, I'll hide myself real quick, and you can kind of see what that looks like so far. All right, so next up, by the way, let me real quickly just get this maximized so that you can see kind of the full HTML structure, just in case I went too fast. You can pause here, by the way. Make sure I have that you have that rather. Okay. All right, let's continue. So next up, we will find out what is next after that section, and that is right here. Start your free trial, and then the get started call to action button, as it's referred to as. So once again, we're going to have to escape out of the blue. We're going to have to close the gray container right here because this is the only two items in it, along with the container element. So we're going to come outside of that. And then the next up, we have to ask ourselves, okay, do we have something else that is, reaching all the way to the end? Well, no, this is just the web page background right here, which is already white. So in that case, we don't have to do a blue container or gray container type of div for this part of the layout. All we have to use is just the container class for this. So div class equals container. And there we go. So now we can put content inside of it, which happens to be that start your free trial now and get started. It's going to look like this for mobile right here. We're going to stack on top of each other. So for that first one, we're going to use another heading element, H2. Start your free trial now. Technically, you could use H1 for this or H3 even. Doesn't really matter. There won't be W3C compliance errors thrown if you do that. Then we're just going to have a simple link for that button. So we're going to do A. The href is going nowhere because we don't have a page defined for that. And then we're going to make a class called CTA, call to action, that we'll use to style it. And then the anchor text is get started, like that. Now notice if we save this, and once again I hide myself, you'll see that this get started button here looks nothing like that green button over here, right? Well, that's the power of CSS. We're going to be able to drastically change the appearance of that simple anchor, that anchor button to this essentially. So it's really powerful. So let's go ahead and finish things off with the bottom part. And this is what we're going to make the bottom footer area to look like. So once again, we do have sort of the opposite effect of this occurring down here because it's a different color and it's also kind of just it's going the opposite direction. If you can pay attention to that a little bit. So we'll do the same sort of thing over here. And once we get done with this section, we're done with the HTML pretty much. So Let's go to footer. We'll say footer is another semantic HTML element that we can use. Designates this section of the layout as being the footer. We're going to put div class. Class is, I'm going to call this footer as well, or footer container rather. Inside of here, we're going to put our div class container because we want it to be structured with and be in line with the rest of the document. We're going to put in a link. This time we'll put a link in for the logo just to show you how that works. So we're going to wrap the logo image because that's the next part that's showing up right here down at the bottom. So we're going to put it, it goes nowhere, of course. And then we can just put in the image of the logo, and we have a white version of it. So the source is images logo-white.svg. We're going to give it a class of logo once again, and then the alt I'll just put in for the description, I'll just put in logo. After that, let's see here, we have a paragraph of the address basically. So let's see, the class is going to be address so that we can specifically style this piece of text. We're going to put Melrose Place 90210. And we're going to put in a break, a line break. So we're going to put in a BR, which is another one of those self-closing tags. And we're just going to put USA right here. So that's just going to push this line on its own to its own section. All right, and then finally, we do have at the bottom a very simple unordered list of links, terms of service, and privacy policy. Now, normally you would probably have more links, maybe the navigation from the top and bottom, but I kind of wanted to keep things a little bit more shorter and less redundant. So I'm going to put UL. We'll give it a class, footer-links. By the way, we could probably get away when we get to the CSS process of just using footer container space UL as the selector to select this, but I'm just choosing not to do that. I'm just showing different ways to do different things. So inside of here, we'll have our list item. Each one is a link, so we're going to put it in an A element, going nowhere because we have no pages set up. And we're just going to say terms of service. And then we're going to replicate this line with Shift Alt and the down arrow key, and then privacy policy. All right. What is happening here? Oh, and that is because I accidentally left that A tag unclosed up here, and it was sitting at the bottom. So we need to put this right here. There we go. So all this stuff should be outside of that. So I was trying to put an anchor text inside an unclosed anchor text link. So that's why the W3C validation is very helpful because it will underline a red error if you screw up like that. So now this is what your the HTML for the footer should look like once you have it completed. All right, so let's save that, and this is our very ugly document that doesn't look anything like this much better looking thing over here. And so that's where we're going to start focused on next, which is the CSS process. All right, so let's get up in our CSS document, Control B over here. We'll go to main.css, and now we can switch back and forth between our main CSS file and an index HTML file. Just real quick as an aside, if you have the space on your browser or your monitor, you can go ahead and go to View, and you can split the view. So if you click here, split editor, you can see both the HTML and CSS, or flip them if you want to. Usually I put the CSS on the right and then the HTML on the left. That way I can see the different selectors that I have at my disposal to reference during the CSS process. Right now though, I don't have enough room because I want the text to be large enough so everything's really larged up here, and I also want to see this preview over here, but that's why it helps as a front-end developer to at least have two monitors so that you can separate things out a bit. So I'm just going to go ahead and let's see here, close out this right here and just go back to my main CSS. So once again, going back to our document, the very first tag that we can style is the body tag. the body element. And you would specify the body element in CSS if you wanted to do something like set a font family if you're using a specific font, or you could change the background color. So here's how that works. I'll show you real quick. So we take the selector. Remember, we're creating a rule set, and we start by a selector. The selector is this body tag itself. And we open it up in our squiggly brackets there. And here's where our declarations go. So by default, you could see that the browser applies certain properties or declarations to different elements. For instance, we can see that there's a little bit of margin between the space of the browser in our elements. If we want to get rid of that, we can type in the margin property and just put 0 and hit save. Notice how when that happened, everything moved on to the very edge. That actually doesn't look better, but I'm going to control the margin myself with our container class that's added here. Also, if you want to change the background, and notice here in Visual Studio Code, when you start typing in a property name, it'll give you any potential suggestions that start with those characters, which is helpful. When it comes to CSS properties like background, there's actually there's very specific properties like background color, or you can use just background itself, which allows you to really add in multiple property values for all of those different things that showed up. So for instance, if I want to change the background color to yellow, which I'm not going to do, we could just do that, which is the same thing as saying background-color yellow. Same thing. However, if we just use background itself, we can also specify other properties like URL. We can put in a background image and all these other things, like if the background attachment is fixed. So that's just something to be aware of. But we're not going to make a custom background property. We're just going to omit that because it's going to be white by default. All right. After that, I do want to put in font family. Now, everybody knows who follows this channel as I'm religious towards my love of Montserrat, which is a certain font that I like. The font family property, it's one of these properties, and by the way, when I start writing out these properties, you're going to see many that maybe you've never seen if you're a beginner. The value, they're all described if you go to Google and you type in CSS font family property and values. If you type that in, you're going to get a bunch of results. Some perhaps from w3schools.com, which is a great resource that will tell you how you structure and what type of values are acceptable. It'll also describe exactly what's happening with each one of these. So this is the font I'm going to use. For the value of font family, you could you can separate your values so that if a person doesn't have Montserrat, for instance, then they'll fall back to another font, the next font that you have in here. Or you can just put sans serif, which means basically any sans serif font that they have installed already. Now, in order to get Montserrat here, which is a web font that we can use, it's basically available in the Google Web Fonts. And if you go to google.com/fonts, you'll find that interface. I'm not going to cover it, but you can search through a ton of different fonts that you can use in your projects, and then it will show you how to import them. It'll give you this code right here, for instance, and it's telling us that we're going to import from this URL, and it's from fonts at google.apis.com. And it tells us the family's Montserrat with the different weights in terms of the thickness or boldness of the font family. So I'm just choosing a regular and a bolder weight right here for these. So now if we save this, notice how all of the fonts just updated from that ugly Times New Roman default font to this font. Already looks better, right? Okay, now we're going to continue on. So there are, when I do my CSS, there's certain things, there's certain rule sets that I like to get out of the way initially. They don't necessarily follow the order from top to bottom. A couple of those are paragraph tags, so we can apply default declarations for those and styles. And also I'm going to put in block quote as well. And in those, font size, I'm going to put in, and remember, there's absolute and relative units that we can use for font size. And I'm going to put in 0.9 EM. All right, so if we go find one of our paragraphs, let's see, like right here, I believe this is a paragraph. We save it. It's going to make it just a little bit smaller. And that was something that I decided to do after seeing everything when the CSS was more complete. But I just wanted it to be a little bit smaller than what it is. This EM unit, by the way, the default font size that's set on the body property that's inherently attached from the browser, that the browser applies to the elements, is around 16 pixels. So 1 EM is equal to 16 pixels, or 2 EM would be equal to 32 pixels in a sense. So when you're using font size, you want to use EM or REM units, which you can. These are topics that are a little bit more intermediate that I would suggest looking up on your own. I'm also going to change the line height, which is another type-based CSS property, which is going to adjust the space between the lines. I'm going to put 1.6 EM, so it should increase the distance between the space of these lines, just as it did right here. And I did that because, again, our job is to try to get it to look as much as like this as possible. You can see there's more line height here than what's being shown. All right. I'm going to do another one that's going to overwrite all of the unordered lists. So I'm simply going to use UL as a selector, and any of the declarations inside of this rule set will apply to all the unordered lists that show up. So notice on all of my unordered lists, we have these little bullet points showing up, those black dots. Let's get rid of those. So the way we can do that is, let's see, list style type, and then we just put none. So now we save it and they all go away. Much, much better. Now there is also some default declarations that are added by the browsers to the unordered list element, such as margin and padding. I want to control those myself, so I'm going to put margin 0 and padding 0. So when we save this, watch what happens. So suddenly they all go away. They're right up against the browser now. After that, now we can start looking at things from a top-down, left-to-right perspective for the most part. The first thing after the body element, which we styled already, is the div class container. So the way we reference a class in our CSS is by putting a period and then the name of it, container. So again, we have a div class of container. The class means the period, container is the name we gave it. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to put in certain CSS properties that make sense to apply to the container element at this mobile view, because we're doing mobile first CSS right here. All right, so any content that is inside of any type-based content that's inside of a container, if you notice over here, it's all centered, isn't it? Like, it's not left aligned. Everything's centered. This is all in a container class. This is all in a container class. These are centered. These are centered. These are centered as well. So we're just going to say text align, which is another CSS property, and an acceptable value for that is center. So if we save it, all of a sudden everything has just become centered. That is inside any of the HTML elements that are inside of that container class. All right. Also, let's give it some padding, because right now everything is really close to the edges, to the top, right, and left edges of the browser. So to fix that, we can give it padding. So margin and padding work very similar to each other. Margin is outside of an element, and padding controls the amount of white space inside of an element, if that makes sense. So we have a lot of things that are inside of our container element. So I'm going to use padding for that. All right, so padding is another one of those properties where you can do padding left, you can do padding right, or you can just use padding itself, where you can control the top, bottom, left, and right all in one declaration. So we're going to do that. And so we could do all 4 values like this. If we know on, say, for example, it starts with the top. So 0.8 EM, for instance. If you just leave it like this, one value, it applies that to all 4 directions. And this doesn't look bad. But if you wanted to control, maybe just the top bottom would be 8, and the right and left could be 1.2 EM if you wanted more on the right and left. All right, there you go. We just shrunk it in a little bit more on the left and right as opposed to the top and bottom. Now, you could also put all 4 of them, all 4 custom directions. So top would be 0.8, the right would be 1.2, the bottom would come next. You could put something here, and then the left could go here. So it works in like a clockwise fashion. But I'm just going to use this orientation right here. And that's all we're going to do for container. Next up after our container is our logo. We gave it a class of logo, so that's how we're going to reference it. Logo. All right, so what do we need done with our logo? This is where it's currently at in the browser, and this is where we need it to be right here. So it needs to be left aligned first and foremost. And we need to make sure I have a good amount of equal white space between the left and the top. All right, so for our logo, the only thing that we're going to do initially on this is we're going to put a width in because it's a little bit large. And I'm going to put in 130 pixels simply because I know, and remember, pixels is one of those units that's absolute. It doesn't change. I don't need the size of the logo to change based on the viewport. So it just scales it down slightly. All right. Another thing that we're going to do is we need this icon right here to show up to the right and this logo to show up to the left. And the way we can do that is notice that we have this header element right here. And inside of the header element, we have this image element right here. And then we have this nav element right here. So we essentially have 2 elements that are the primary elements or parent elements right here. So this one has a bunch of other elements, of course, but they're just child elements of this element right here. So we have 2 elements. What we can do is target the header element like this, and we can say display flex, and then we'll also put in justify content space between and save it. All right, so look at what just happened there. This pushed it over to the left. It's not quite right of the spacing, and I'll demonstrate how to fix that in a second. But it basically created a layout called a flex box layout. And there are different types of properties that you can use for display, such as display block, display grid is very popular, and display flex as well, and inline. But flex is a real easy way if you have small elements in your user interface that need basically structured into columns like this. So the one thing that's throwing us off is probably this section right here. On our mobile viewport, we don't want that to show up by default, right? Which is why we placed onto it this UL class right here, hide desktop. So, or hide mobile rather. Let me make sure I have this all set up. We're going to put in hide mobile. I had that wrong. Make sure you update that right there. It's confusing me for a second. So we're going to create that class of hide mobile. So I'm going to put it right here. Doesn't really matter where you put it, by the way. You could put this at the very top or bottom. It doesn't matter. I'm going to put display none. There we go. All of a sudden, it has been hidden, and it is much closer to what we have here so far. Okay, so if you're confused by this, there's a lot of different tutorials that go into just Flexbox and how to orient things with Flexbox, as well as the grid. These are all things that I'm not going to get into very much here because it would really eat up a ton of time. But that's just how a very quick way you can take 2 items that are usually stacked on top of each other by default and then move them into different columns side by side. All right, so after that, we have our menu icon, which we have a class, I believe, of menu. Yeah, there it is. So this right here has a class of menu. So let's reference that. It's a little bit small looking. So we're going to take menu, and we're going to say width around 25 pixels. Again, it's one of those absolute elements that I don't need the size to really change. So it makes it a little bit bigger. And notice it just seems off, right? It doesn't seem in line where it needs to be in relation to this logo. So we can control the position with margin this time. So we can put margin and look at all the potential elements that, or potential property values that we can use. I'm just going to use margin top just to push it from the top. And I'm going to do that probably, I'm going to say by 45%. Now, how did I know to choose 45%? I didn't know how to choose right off the bat 45% when I was preparing this project. The way I did it is just through experimentation. And you may be wondering, why did I not use a percentage or an absolute value? I mean, why did I not use a pixel value perhaps for that? But basically, the reason for that is when you scale up the interface here, and you're going through different screen sizes, and you're dealing with margins and paddings, or the white space essentially associated with the UI, you want things to be as fluid as possible. So I put in 45% there. I experimented with the value just to see how it affected, and this was the right around the right area to go. And also, when you're dealing with white space and percentages, you're going to want to increase it just to see, like for instance, this would be the width or so of like a tablet. This would be like a desktop, and you can see how things sort of react based on that. All right, I know I'm talking a lot, but I really want to try to get this stuff explained as much as possible. All right, so after that, what do we have? We have this graphic right here. All right, so let's see. I'm not going to worry about doing the HTML for this. We'll do that once we get to the desktop portion. The next element that we have after this and the navigation is section. All right, so we can use section as a selector, and with the section right here, actually we don't need to do anything. I think it was redundant. I put text align center, but we don't need to do that because we already placed that on the container element. So instead of that, we can reference this image, which is the server class. So that server is right here, the class of server. So server, and in here it's a little bit too large, way too large. So we're going to put width 70%. All right, that's pretty much better, a lot better. And notice how, because of the shadow, this graphic is actually like this. It's offset. It is actually centered, but it doesn't look centered because of the shadow is kind of far off into the distance. So we're going to adjust the position by margin, and we're going to put in 2EM at the top, so it's going to push it down from the logo. We're going to put auto for the left. We're going to put TAM on the bottom again, and then 25% on the right. And that gets things evened up a little bit more. Again, this is experimentation essentially when it comes to these values. I didn't just know right off the bat what they're going to look like. So notice how it scales up now. It's a responsive image because the width is based on the percentage of itself inside of the container class element. All right, very cool stuff. Okay, let's continue on. Next we have our H1 and our subhead class. So we have H1 selector and a class of subhead. And so we have to ask ourselves, again, you always need to be going back to the UI to see, what need change. Does this need to be bigger? Does this need to be bigger or smaller? All right, so certainly this needs to be bigger in my opinion, and I think this needs to be bigger as well. So right away, I'm going to put in. Actually, I'm not going to add a style to this just yet. I think it will because I might forget in the end. What I'm going to do is put in H1 and then subhead. So these are both part of the same rule set. And I'm going to put in some two different declarations that aren't going to make sense called position relative and z-index of 3. Now, nothing really changes about these from appearance here, but based on, real quickly, this right here, the CSS required for this right here, there's actually a circle that will show up when we get to that point, and we don't want that circle to overlap, this white circle to overlap on the text right here. And so that's what that fixes by setting those to position relative, and then z-index of 3 means it's going to stack it on top of that graphic, the circle graphic that is used to create that sort of interesting effect in the blue container. So hopefully that's not too confusing at this point. I think we will get to a point where we might adjust the size, but not at this point. So going on, oh yeah, the subhead actually, I am going to reference specifically and say font size about 0.9. Actually, no. About 1.3 EM or 1. Yeah, right around there, I think is okay. I think further on, I do have a style for this to make this larger, but I don't want to get out of track with my reference monitor here. So we're going to leave that right here for now. All right, so next up is our blue container, which is right here. All right, so blue container is this thing. All right, so let's go ahead and create the rule set for that. Blue-container. All right, so the width is 100% of the browser. Again, we're not going to see anything. Let's give it a background. And we'll find the background hex code right here by clicking this and then copying this code and pasting it in right there. So you can copy this if you want, 002C2FF. So that now all of a sudden when we save this, things start to make a lot more sense now. I mean, of course, they're not all accurate in here yet, but we'll get to that stuff. So after that, we want the text to be white. And the way you control text color in CSS is through the color property. And we can either say white if we know it's going to be absolutely white, or you can use color hex code values. For white, it happens to be the number sign FFF. Same thing. All right, but generally, if you can achieve something with fewer lines of type, you can. It's best. Also, in Visual Studio Code, if you hover over a color value, it'll allow you to select properties or values right here. All right, so after that, let's give some margin to this. Look how close this icon is to the top here. So let's type in margin, and we'll do 15%. We'll say also 0 on the right and 0 on the bottom. So it's only going to apply really to the top. So we could actually get away with just putting in margin hyphen top 15%. It would be the same thing. Oh, and by the way, I was referring to the top up here, not the inside, which would be padding. Okay. Next after that, we're going to deal with padding, which is inside. So on the top, we'll say 4EM. And let's just save that. Now that means it's going to get 4EM all the way around, which is way too much, so we don't want that. Then we're going to put 0, and then on the bottom we're going to put 2EM as well. And the reason I'm giving 2EM on the bottom is because eventually we're going to have margin that's applied to the bottom of each list item, so that kind of offsets it. Ordinarily, it would make sense normally maybe to put 4EM equally, but you can see it's unequal a little bit. There's less up here than there is down there because there is default margin applied to these list item elements, pushing them down. So the last one has a little bit. Let me show you a tip, by the way, about that. If you want to see margin and padding applied to your UI elements, you hold Control-Shift-I, and we go over here we select this, like the little icon. And notice how when we hover over, we can see a little like this orange area. That's letting us know how much padding is being applied to these different elements. And so that's just one thing. That's just one way to know if there's any amount of padding anywhere that's being applied when you're trying to deal with setting up your white space. All right, so again, we're going to go back and make that 2EM on the bottom. There we go. All right, so let's continue on. We're not done yet with the declarations here. So now let's figure out how we can make this turn into this right here. All right, so the first thing I want to do is we're going to round off the corner right here. So our container is kind of flat like this and it's square, but we can very easily create this rounded corner. And we can do that with something called border radius. Now, if I just type in border radius and type in something like 40 pixels, you can see how it applies to all four corners, this border radius, and it just kind of creates, you know, these little circle areas right here. And by the way, if you wanted to create a perfect circle, you could just put border radius 50%. But we're not going to do that for now. But if we only wanted to apply it to this side, this corner, we have a shorthand property for this. So border top left radius. So now when we save that, we could see everything else is a corner except for this area. So now we've just achieved this right here. Next, notice how right now it's completely flat. We do have a sort of a curve applied to it at an angle, so we can skew it. So to do that, we're going to use another very powerful property that accepts a lot of different values called transform. And we're going to say skew y. Notice when I type in skew, it's given us these potential functions here that we can use that start with skew. You can use skew, which allows you to control both X and Y skew, or just X and Y itself. We only want to skew it vertically, so we're going to use Y, and a negative about 2 degrees. Now, look what just happened. Everything inside of this blue container has just been skewed. Even the elements in here have been skewed because they are child elements. We don't want that. We just want these elements. We want these elements to be just normal, right? Because it'd be kind of hard to read. We just want this interesting aesthetic placed on the container itself. So a real quick hack that I discovered, and a lot of times you may have to go to Google to figure out how to do certain things. Even me, I've been doing this forever. And the one way I found to fix that is to take blue container, UL, right here. Notice this is, and that's one way you can set up your selectors. You can choose a parent containers class, for instance, and say any of the ULs inside of it. So that's one way to do that, to target selectors like this. So the ULs inside of blue container, we can say transform, skew Y, and then we'll go opposite, 2 degrees. The effect of this is it now returns it to normal. So it just reads like it normally did before, but the container itself has now been skewed at that slight angle. Very, very cool. All right, so now let's try to do the more tricky part, which is to try to get this inverted sort of angle right here. All right, now we're getting into intermediate to advanced CSS right here. So I don't expect you to fully understand about what's about to happen here. But in CSS, when it comes to any of your elements, we have these other selectors that we can use that we can style just both before the containing the HTML element and after. All right, so a common way of achieving something unique like that is we'll take our blue container, we're going to put a comma, or a colon rather, after. All right. Now this says it represents a stylable child pseudo element immediately after the original element's actual content, if that at all makes sense to you. And what we're going to do is, in order first for this to work, this sort of thing to work, we have to put in a content property, making it empty. Next, we're going to give it a width of about 80 pixels, and then we're going to give it a height of 80 pixels, and we're going to give it a background color of white. Right now we can't see it, but it's up right around here, I believe, or inside. And you'll see this in a second. What we'll do, first I should have done this one because we're doing both. I just copied this, a before and an after. We need the before first. I was looking at the wrong selector. Just keep this here for a second. What we're going to do here is change this to 40 pixels and the height to 40 pixels. And this color, this blue color, is going to be the same color as this. So we're going to copy this code and we're going to put it right there. All right, and then what we're going to do is we're going to make it position absolute. And this is another way of taking an HTML element, and when it comes to the position property and setting it to absolute, you can pretty much move it anywhere around on the HTML document. With that, with the position absolute, you can use top and say from wherever its starting position is, we'll say we'll subtract about 39 pixels. Now we can see it right there. This right here, I'm just going to copy it and hide it. I don't want that confusing anybody because the only thing that matters right now is this element right here. So we're going to put right. From the right, we want it to 0 because we're going to push this all the way over there. Hopefully things are making a little bit more sense now because I know I'm confusing the absolute beginners. After that, we're going to put in a z-index, which controls the stack order of it in the browser to like -2. That doesn't do anything, but you'll see when we placed on this here position relative and we gave it a z-index of 3, that'll make sure that it sits on top of both this here and the circle that we use to cut this out in a second. All right, so that looks pretty good here. Let's bring back this right here. All right, so let's keep on adding to this. And the point that we're going to start seeing this is when we put in top -80 pixels, or at least I thought we were, we have to put position absolute first. And then also right, we have to push it to the 0, or push it over to the 0. And then also border, we want it to be a circle. Remember, right now it's a square, that's why it's hiding it. We're going to put border radius 50%. And then we're going to put in, oops, sorry about that, one more property. Notice right there, it's now doing what we want. Z-index is -1. Set that there. All right, so hopefully that was not too confusing. I'm sure it was, but if you're a beginner, chances are you're not going to be doing too much crazy stuff like this. But I wanted to introduce a little bit of the intermediate stuff, just a little bit, just so you can see what's possible with CSS. But don't let it discourage you if you're kind of like, what the heck was, what just happened there? So hopefully you can understand what is possible. So let's continue on. Next, we're going to control the appearance of these elements right here. The first thing that I want to do is the size of these icons and the distance between these elements need to be fixed a bit. So what I'll do is blue container, UL, LI. We're going to say margin bottom like 3EM, so that spaces them out as you just saw. We're also going to do the same thing here, except we're going to target the paragraphs. So again, if we look at the HTML and we look at the order of things, we have blue container, UL, LI, P. All right, we can say for the padding, I'm going to put 0 on the top and bottom, but 0.5 on the right and left, just to push it in a little bit closer. All right, I don't think that actually made that much of a difference from what I've seen. We'll have to reanalyze that and see if that was even necessary. Blue container, the image itself. And notice you don't really have to fall in line with like going like blue container, then the class container, then UL, then LI. You can actually switch up the order. So we could just say any images inside of blue container by just putting blue container class space image. All right, so we can say width. We're going to scale this down, and I found that 14% was pretty good right there. Now notice how big this other icon is, and the reason is because the width in the orientation, the fact that this icon here is in like a portrait mode, it makes it look bigger. So how do we style this one down specifically? Well, here's where we use what's called the nth child. So you'll see we'll put blue container, UL, LI, we'll say nth hyphen child, and then it's a function and accepts number 3. So we'll say it's the third list item that's inside of this selector right here. Because you'll see it's 1, 2, 3 that this icon shows up right there. And we'll give that a specific width of around 8%. Oh, something just got screwed up. All right, I'm gonna make sure. Oh, yes. We're saying right here, we're selecting the list item, but we need the image inside of it. So we just put space image afterwards. There we go. Now we scaled it down and it looks better. Awesome, awesome stuff. All right. So after that, we have our gray container. All right. So that's in reference to this stuff right here. And you can see they're pretty big. They're real too close. So we have to adjust the white space with margin and padding and all that good stuff. So let's go here. So I have a gray container. And we're going to say the background first needs to be gray. Right now it's completely white by default. So what gray are we using here? It's F6, F6, F6. So we say background. Oops, I already put a hashtag there. Let's save that. So it just makes it's a very light white, off-white. And then we're going to put padding. We're going to say 4EM on the top, 0 on the right and left, and then 2EM on the bottom. So now we have an even amount of white space between these elements. Awesome. Not done yet though. So we're also going to put in, by the way, because this is skewed, you can see it's very hard. I'm not sure if you'll be able to see on the video. There's a little bit of white right here between these two elements because this is skewed right here. And by the way, the fact that this is skewed and it's not in the right here doesn't bother me much. I actually kind of like it that it's skewed a little bit like this. We're going to take a margin top and we're going to push this up. And this will show up underneath, and it will get rid of this little white space that's between those elements. So if we do margin top, and again, margin applies to the white space outside of an element, and padding is inside. If we do margin top, we can actually do negative units. So we can put negative like 3%. And there it goes. It just got rid of it. Not sure if you could see that. Hopefully you'll notice it yourself. All right, so that's it for the gray container styling. And now, what about this? Yeah, this stuff is all pretty bad. She's pretty. These are pretty large graphics. So let's get those figured out. First of all, I only want to target this list item. So let's do that. Gray container, and we're going to say UL LI. And then another selector that we can use, a pseudo selector, is first child. First child, it means it's simply the first child that shows up inside of the list item. We can say margin bottom 2EM. So it's going to push down separation here, but it's not going to apply it to here. It would if we just did ULLI. And that would give us too much on the bottom, I believe. So I just did first child here. All right, and then after that, let's reference our figure semantic element right here, which is basically everything inside of right here. So we'll do figure, margin 0, padding 0. And the reason I'm doing this is because the browsers by default put on some margin and padding, I believe, on the figure element. So if we save it, it does free up some margin and padding there. Fig caption, which is the user's name. We're going to say font weight is bold. Watch how they update. And then color is going to be the blue color that we've been using right there. Next, we're going to take our H2 element. And we're going to say margin top by about 7% because it's pretty close. You might not be able to see it. This is pretty close to this container right here, the gray container. It's a very subtle. So if we save it, it pushes it down a bit. And then we have our call to action buttons. This thing, the green get started, or it's going to be green rather. We need it to look like this down here. So there's quite a few CSS properties, and it's fun once you get the hang of it. I'm going to move this over just so you can see how things are going to update on the Get Started button. So we have our call to action. Oops. All right, it's a class, so we put a period. Background color. We're going to put, it's 00 CC80. So now we can see how that updated. Next, we're going to say width. We're going to use that calc function that you saw at the beginning of the course. We're going to say 100% minus 1em. And you're going to see why we're doing this in a second. We're going to put display block, and that's a required CSS element if you're going to give a anchor text width. And again, this is the stuff, you know, hopefully that you'll remember going forward. Color, we want to change the color of the text inside of it to white. All right. We also want to give it a border radius of 50%. That makes it round. Oops, nope, I'm wrong. 20 pixels. There we go. We also want to give it some padding. So padding is the white space inside of the element. So the padding will say 0.5 em to make it larger. You can see it's starting to come along. We're also going to put text hyphen decoration. If you don't want an underline, we've set that to none. So now it goes away. We're going to take our font size and increase it because it's quite small. And we'll say 1.5 em, which is 16 pixels, which is the default size of text in a browser, times 1.5. And then also margin. This is going to move things around a little bit. I'm going to use fluid units here. So 3% on the top, auto, 7% on the bottom. So it's going to move things just a bit. And then we're going to put position relative as well and put z-index, same thing that we did with that text up top, to 4, because we're going to be doing the same thing for this section down here. We don't want it to overlap this circle over here. By the way, I didn't add those values initially. I saw the problem and then I solved it by adding position relative and z-index. There could be other ways, by the way, to do other things in here, but that's the way I found to do it. So that's it for our button. It looks pretty solid right here as it stands. So next we have our footer container, which is, let me move things back over a little bit. There we go. Right here. So right here rather, footer container. All right, so our footer container is going to be a width of 100%. A lot of this is going to be, the rule set for this is going to be similar to the blue container, by the way. We're going to have background. It has a different color, which is 3D444A. All right, and then also a color of white. A padding of 3 em on the top and bottom, 0 on the right and left. I might as well bring this back in so you can see it so it's not behind me. There we go. It's already coming along. We're also going to do our border, top right radius. The other one was left before, top left. This is going to be 40 pixels. So notice how it does that to the right. Also, we're going to have transform skew. Y is going to be, the other one was -2 degrees. Ours is going to be +2 degrees because we're sloping it the other direction. And then after that, we're going to put in Now that's going to be it in and of itself. So now we have to do that same old fix where we revert it back on the other SKU. To do that, we'll put footer container and find its container inside of it. So then we put, I'm just going to copy this real quick. This will be -2. There it goes. So this goes back to being just horizontal text. And then we have our footer container, our before selector. And then we do pretty much the same thing as before, although some of it's reverted and switched around because it's on the other side. So content, empty content area. If we don't add this, you'll see it won't work for this tag when it comes to styling elements like this with these before and after selectors. You simply won't see the result in the browser. So then we put width 40 pixels, height is 40 pixels, background color is going to be the same as the one it's sitting on top of. Can't see anything yet because we need to do position absolute. And then top is -39 pixels. There it is. And then left is 0. Z index, we'll put it -2. Notice how this is sitting on top. If that call to action didn't have this, this would be sitting on top. That's not what we want. So that's what that does. And that looks good there. And then we have our footer container after selector. So inside of here, once again, content is empty. Our width is 80 pixels. Height as well. Our background color is white. We have our position absolute. Z index is going to be sitting on top of that square that we have, so it's not going to be -1, just -2. I mean, it is going to be -1, not -2. The top is -80 pixels to get that circle situated there correctly, and the left is going to be 0. And then we have to make sure I'm not missing the border radius, which makes it into a circle. And there we have it. If you actually want to see what's happening here, we can change this color to something else. As you can see, it's just kind of an effect that's applied like that, but we're just making it white. There we go. All right, very, very close to getting done. Next, we have the footer links down here, which need to be styled up. So we're going to do ul.footer links. Now, notice how I put the selector and then a .ul. You could just write .footer links because this is in reference to, let's see here, right here, where it says ul class is footer links. And so that's basically that's up to you if you want to do that. Sometimes it can help just for readability to know what that class is in relation to. So when we do that, we're going to put margin 0 auto, which is a way to center things. And we can also put in our li element. So inside of ul, we have our list items, right? So let's try to style this li element. So we put li after. And inside of here, we're going to put just display inline block. And that's one way that you can structure things to the left and right of each other outside of display flex as well. And so then what we can also do is style the actual text themselves, because the text is the anchor text and it's inside. This text falls inside of the A tag right here. So once again, we'll just copy this to save ourselves some spacing, or typing rather, some time. And we'll put in, for this one, a color. And it's not quite white. It's like 9D, 9D, 9D. That's the color code from, there it is, from Adobe XD, our design app. And then a font size, we can make 0.8 EM, just to scale it down a little bit like that. All right. we are quite far now. And as far as I'm concerned, this is pretty much, what I like for the mobile. And this is very close to the example that we have in our XD document. So the next step is to start styling up our navigation. So let's go ahead and do that. Temporarily, I'm going to come up here. Let's scale this out. I'm going to come out here and I'm going to remove the hide desktop, or hide mobile rather, class right here. In fact, I'm just going to misspell it, and you'll see we get our menu back. So we need to start styling that as it should appear. All right. So to start doing that, what we're going to say is if we look back here, we have our nav element, and then we have our unordered list element, which contains all of our navigation elements right here. So we can reference that several different ways, but I'm just going to say nav ul nav element. Rather, we're going to go opposite, nav ul. There we go. So we have our nav, and then any ULs, unordered lists inside of our nav element gets these following declarations. So we're going to put position fixed. All right. Now what that does is when you scroll, it keeps it here. It keeps the navigation like stuck into place so that it stays there. Next up, we're going to have a width. I think I want the navigation to come out by about 60%. Now, of course, it's hidden, but you'll see it'll come back momentarily. We're going to make our top 0 and also our right 0 because we want it to come in from the right. And there it is, showing back up again. Next, we're going to say text align. We're going to align it to the left of this container, our UL. And then we're going to say background. And this time I'm using an RGB value of 36, 41, 44. You may be wondering, how did I get that? It's just because I put like an initial value of like blue and then I hovered over it and I chose this color right here, and it automatically gives us the RGB values. Next, we're going to have a height. We want it to be 100%. And notice, because of our these other position elements, like of position relative and absolute, it's showing up behind everything. So we control that with Z index, make it something high like 7. We want it to be on top of everything, just like that. And then we're going to say padding top 3 EM. So the padding applies to the white space inside of this container. And so we're just pushing things down a bit. Next, we're going to say nav ul lia. So that's selecting all the anchor text inside of this selector. And we're going to make it color white. We're going to say text decoration none. We're going to display block. And displaying block doesn't really look like it changes anything, but it's going to allow us to set width and height on it. So we're going to say width 100%. And we're going to say padding is going to be 1 EM on the top and bottom and 2 EM on the left and right. So now it's starting to look better. Background color is going to be, we can actually give this a separate background color if we wanted to, which is, I will just to show you. RGB would be like 52, 59, and 63. And again, the way I got that value is I just copied this. I'll just show you real quick. I gave it the same color, and then I hovered over it and just made it a little bit lighter. And it adjusts the values for us. There we go. Next up, we're going to have, let's see, yeah, that's it for this element right here. Next we have, if you want to do something like hover, make things change based on hover, we can add the hover selector. So if we take this and just put hover, then we can say background color, and we can do the same process. We can copy this, and then we can make it a different color or a little bit lighter or darker or whatever. So now look at that, very simple. So hopefully you're having a lot of aha moments going forward here. So exit button, is a class that we gave to this element right here, and that's right here, class exit btn. So in there, we're going to say clear. No, we're not. Sorry about that. What we're going to say is margin bottom is 1 em just to push it away. And as you can see, it just did there. Margin top, you can use negative 1.3 em to kind of push it up into where approximately it would be. We're going to text align right. So you can use text align for images, by the way, as you just saw. And then we can say padding 0 on the top and bottom, 1.4 em on the right and left. And I want to make the image itself larger. And you can see that our image is actually inside of this class right here. So we have to come out and put exit -btn image img, and we'll say width is 15 pixels and cursor pointer. And I'm not going to save that because look, when you hover over it, if it's not a link, nothing happens, but it should change to a pointer icon. So there we go. Now we click on it, nothing happens. Nothing happens on any of this, but that's when JavaScript will come into play. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is go back and we're going to fix this and make it back to hide mobile, and we'll save it. So notice when we save it, it goes right away because it has this hide mobile class that is hiding it by default. So if we extend this out, even the desktop view, it's still staying there when it shouldn't. When we scale this out to a desktop resolution, it should switch back to showing this type of menu. So how do we take that menu that we just designed and make it look like this? And you'll see very shortly, because that's what we're going to get into now, which is the media queries and the responsive design. Okay, so we're going to do our first media query here at the bottom. So everything we did right here is what I said was a mobile first CSS. This all looks like great on a mobile viewport, but if we look at it at the desktop, it does not look good at all. Things are still stacked on top of each other. These should be in 3 columns as it is in our mockup. And so that's what's going to be the responsibility of our responsive design and our media queries to get that stuff working correctly. So here's what our first media query will look like. At media, only screen and min width 650 pixels. So how did I arrive at this value? So basically, first of all, when we say minimum width, it's going to say, what that is essentially saying is once the resolution or the viewport of the screen that is viewing this is larger than 650 pixels, so 615 pixels and larger, then apply any of the rule sets here inside of this area. So you can put multiple rule sets all inside of these brackets right here. And how did I arrive at 650 pixels? Well, the way I do it is first I hit Control-Shift-I, and you'll see right up here when we start to scale it out, it lets us know what the width and height of the viewport is. So if I scale this out, what I'm asking myself is, okay, I like what things look like here. Do I want to change anything as I go out? So should things start to change? And I deemed right around 650, certain things probably should change about the layout in some way or form. Like this might be too big. Some other things may need changed. So the first thing I will change is the size of this server. So I'm going to say the server, which is the class we gave it, width, and we'll say 50%. Now, if we find that server, because we already have a rule set for it up here, we have width 70% and also a margin. But if I don't specify the margin down here in the media query, then it's just going to assume whatever was defined before it. So the only thing that's going to change is the width. So let's save that. Notice it just got smaller. So if we go between, so here we are at less than 650 pixels. Now watch right when it gets to 650 pixels, it goes down. It just automatically snaps down. And so now that's how we can control our rule sets and make them dynamic in a sense based on the screen size that's viewing them. So a couple other things I want to change. This is a little bit small. So let's take our H1, which is the HTML element selector that text is being wrapped around. Font size, we'll say 3 EM, make it larger. And when you make the font size larger, it will apply some padding on it. I decided I kind of wanted in margin as well, so no margin. Margin is what I meant. There we go. So I kind of moved things up a little bit when I did that. Also, we'll take our subhead, which is the class for this. We're going to make that larger too, because it looks a little bit too small. So we'll say font size for that will be 1.4 EM. And then also we're going to make margin bottom 12%. All right, so it pushes things down quite a bit here in this area. All right, next after that, we're going to take our blue container. So blue container, margin, and set it to 0. And that just moves things around. You could do the same thing with just margin 0 like that. I had that like that initially because I think we had multiple values and I just set them all to 0, but it's the same as just putting 0 right here. Also, the images are a little bit too large, right? I mean, I think they are a little, yeah, just I don't like them. So what we'll do is say blue container, image, width 20%. And actually it's a little bit too large for my liking there. Trying to look at where that's changing at. Actually, probably like 10% looks better, will look better there. Yeah, probably right around there. And then what we can also do is reuse the rule set that we had before for controlling this one. Just like that. And make that width here. Probably leave it, well, we'll say like 7% or smaller. Right around there is fine. I'm just looking at the thickness of the lines, probably 6%. And then also margin top, we'll say -6 pixels. And this doesn't really make sense right now to put margin top here, but when we change this so that these are side by side in another different media query, getting these even will make sense a lot more. So we'll see in a second actually what that does. So if we put blue container UL and we want these to align to each other in 3 columns, because right now it just kind of looks silly with all this. We have enough room. We could put display flex, and when we do that, it automatically sets these side by side. That's why I had these larger at 20%. There we go. I was confused. I forgot I should have done this first. So this is actually 11%. There we go. And if we don't have margin top -6 on that, it kind of pushes things down a bit. Might be a better way of going about that, but this works. All right, so now watch this. When we're at this smaller viewport of the mobile, they're stacked. But now once we get to this media query of beyond 650, it is stacking them right next to each other. Now a couple other adjustments I want to make to that is margin top, maybe -1 EM on the entire unordered list, and then also align items center. All right, and a couple other things I want to add. This doesn't look correct. I think a couple of rule sets that I have will fix this in a second. is the actual li elements themselves. So ul li. Margin bottom, we're going to set to 0. There we go. And then also the paragraph elements, we're going to adjust the padding between a little bit close, I think. So if I take this, and don't worry, we're going to be done pretty soon. So ULLIP, we're going to take the padding to 0 on the top and bottom, and on the right and left, ADM. So we're increasing just a bit the right and left padding. And then also our grade container, these should also be floating to the left of each other too. So we just put display flex. It's not working just right yet. Oh, that's because this needs to be grade container UL. There we go. Awesome. And then our nav UL. So if we brought that nav UL back, it would be all the way 60%. It's just too much, so I want to bring it back to the width of that to around here at 40%. So we're not going to see that change just yet. All right, awesome. So that's it for this media query, I think. Once we get to this size, things are pretty good, right around 650. So the next thing we do is keep on going out and think, okay, what needs to change about this layout as we go further and further in terms of the width. So I would say right around 875, there's a couple things I want to change. So our subheading, I think I want to adjust the margin a little bit, as well as the margin of the blue container ULs just a bit. So let's do that. I'm going to copy this and come outside of that media query and start a new one and put 875. All right, so inside of here, we're going to put in subhead class, margin bottom, 15%. So it's really going to space things out more for us. And we're going to say blue container, UL, a margin on the top of 0, 0, and 4% on the right, and 0 there. And then also grade container, UL. We'll say margin is a 4% on the top and 0, 0 there. So we're just basically situating the ULs a little bit more for more white space on the larger viewports, which makes more sense. You have more space to fill, same amount of content. You want things spread out further. And I think that's looked pretty good until we get to around about 1024, which is like around a tablet size or so in larger, in desktop even. So what we're going to change there is we're going to start to show the navigation and hide this. All right, so what we'll do is create another one. And don't worry, guys, we're getting close to being finished with this. We only have like 2 more media queries after this. 1024. And inside of here, just coming down, looking at this, that call to action button looks really silly being that large. So let's change that. CTA is the class. The width will be 50%. There we go. That's a lot better. So watch how it goes from all the way out down to 50% once we get to 1024 right there. Then we're going to have outside of that, we're going to take our container. This is the part where the container has pretty much been the full width. It's been fluid up to this point, but now I kind of want to keep it a little bit more centered. So what we'll do is take our container and we're going to give it a width of 80%. So notice once we do that, things kind of come in, but we also need to center it. So we're going to put margin 0 auto, and then I'm going to give it on the bottom, we're going to give it some white space and auto. Sort of like that. And actually, I think I'm going to get rid of that. That doesn't make sense to me at this point in time. I may adjust that later, but this looks a lot better. So notice how if we bring this in it's at 100% width, but when we get to this size, it's staying more in the center. Because when we get to the larger, I don't want it to go all the way out. It'll spread things out too far, in my opinion, with content that's so sparse like this. Okay, so let's go back to right around our 1024, and oh yeah, I was looking at the wrong thing when I applied that 13%. I was looking at the wrong set on my reference monitor. Next, we're going to have show desktop. Now, that was a class that we applied on a few things to show them once the desktop shows up. So we're going to put display block, because normally there's a display hidden with the show mobile class. And guess what? When we do that, this starts to show up. And by the way, it's at 40% now as opposed to 60% on the mobile version. And this is the margin that I wanted to apply right here. So margin is 0 auto, 13% in auto. All right. And then after show desktop, we're going to have hide desktop. I think we had hide desktop. We're going to put display none on that. All right, and so then what we want to do is notice how this is showing up. This is supposed to show up, but the problem is it's so styled differently. We need to reset the styling to make it look like this up here, which is very different. So let's get the rule sets rewritten here for this. So we have a nav ul element, which is for this whole container here. And we're going to change position here to inherent. So it's just kind of resetting it back to, it's going from position fixed to just whatever it inherits, which is a potential and acceptable property value. The width is also going to be reset to auto. The background is going to be set to none. The height is going to go to auto. The display is going to go to flex. And we're going to put heading top, which it did have some before, to 0. Next, we're going to have our nav ulli. We're going to put float left here. And then we're going to put nav ullia. And this is going to restyle the links themselves. So color is going to be black. We're going to have background color. We could put inherit as well. So now we can see it's looking much closer. We're going to set, let's see here, text align right. So that pushes things over more towards this side. And also, we're going to do padding to this. 1em, 2em, like that. Actually, I think it already, yeah, I think that did make a change. You don't want to reuse and set the same exact values. I think that was different before. And I think that looks good right here. And then, as of course, when it comes to our hover, we don't want it to hover like that. That looks terrible. So we'll just put in our hover selector, and we'll say background color is inherit. Like that. Awesome. All right, so now watch what happens to this. It goes away, and when we get to the JavaScript real quickly, we'll make that other normal menu show up. And once we get to this, this shows up just like that. All right, so there's, let's see here. Let's see what else should be changed. I think we're going to have one more rule set here. Oh, we're also going to make this animate. I didn't talk about animation at all, so we'll do this real quickly. So let's make this hover up and side, or like up and down. So to do that, we have a class targeted onto it called scroll. If I could find it. Right here. So the class is scroll. Notice we have the hide mobile and show desktop, so it hides like that. So let's make it scroll here, or animate. So we'll target scroll within this media query, and we'll say width 30 pixels, make it a little bit smaller, and we're going to give an animation property. And notice there's a lot of other animation properties you can use. But we'll use the full one here and just say we're going to call it move. You have to give the animation a name. I'm just going to call it move. For 2 seconds is duration. You can also put delays and all this other stuff, so make sure you look up this property on your own. We're going to make it animate infinite forever, and we're going to alternate back and forth. Now nothing happens yet because we have to define this in keyframes. So we put at keyframes and the name of the animation, and then we're going to say we can put from and to, or we can put in multiple keyframe animations with percentage values. So for instance, 0%, we'll say transform, translate Y because we want to move up and down, 0 pixels, and then we'll put 100%, and then we could say transform Y maybe 20 pixels. So notice how it's going up and down now. Maybe it makes this a little bit quicker. There we go. And this, you can put 0%, and by the way, you could put like 10% here, then 50%. You can really add multiple steps where you control multiple declarations inside of here. You can also just put, if you know it's from and to, you can put just from 0% and then to. Same thing, it will work just the same. And by the way, I should mention some of these properties, when you're using them, and you're not using any sort of build tool that will add like auto prefixer as it's called, sometimes you have to add in things like WebKit animation. WebKit is a a vendor prefix as it's called. I'm not doing that now because I don't want to bog down too much information here, but just be wary of that because your properties, your CSS properties can work in some browsers, and then in others they may not, and that could be because you need to add in those other vendor prefixes. So that's just something to consider going forward. Okay, so now there's only really just one more. Let's see, a media query to write for. This is kind of all screwed up looking when we get to the big sizes. All right, so let's make a few adjustments there from 1600 pixels and beyond. And then after this, we'll use a little bit of JavaScript to get the menu working on mobile and then be done. All right, so 1600 pixels. And we'll say the first thing I want to adjust is the server icon. It's pretty huge. So we're going to take the width down to 40% here. And 1600 pixels must be out here. There we go. So we're scaling it down, and we have to readjust the margin again. So 5em auto, 4em, 15%. There we go. It's kind of centering it up a little bit better. Our container, we're going to take down from 80% to 70. So it's going to push things in even more. So it's already looking better. So just with the minute changes, there could be big differences. Our blue container, I'm going to say we're going to give it some different padding. So if we look at the blue container, we're going to change the padding up to 7em, 0, and 2em. So it spaces things out more. We're going to put blue container, ULLIP. So we're going to make adjustments to the paragraphs here. To make them larger, and the block quote text from the testimonials. So font size 1.3em. So notice they get quite a bit larger. And then also gray container. We'll say padding is 6em, 0, and 4em. So we're readjusting the white space up here just a little bit like that. And then also just 3 more rule sets and we're done with the CSS. So H2, margin top, we'll say 4em. So that's adjusting this section right here, giving it more white space. We'll say blue container, image, we'll say width is 15%. All right, so we're adjusting our logo there, I believe. And then, oh no. We're adjusting the size of these. And then, of course, we're going to adjust. And at this point, I'm just going to paste in this rule set. We're going to fix this again because I thought the icons were too big. There we go. So that's what that CSS looks like right there. And that's it with the CSS. All right, so now we take this and we go all the way from like a mobile view. Things all look good here. Things are looking good here as well. You can see the breakpoints, how the styles adjust themselves. All right, this is off center. I think that needs to be fixed, but I'm not going to worry about that right now at this point in time. All right, so now let's get this menu right here working. Click it and nothing happens, and that's the rule of JavaScript. So you can include JavaScript inline, like in the HTML file itself, which is what we're going to do. Or you could use the script source and attribute and you link a specific JS file. We're not going to do that though. I'm just going to show you how to write it inline, because there's not going to be a ton of JavaScript. So the way we do this is we put script. So we have our script element here. And this is where we write a JavaScript now. So we can put a variable of menu. So we're going to say document.get element by ID menu. All right, so remember I said we did place ID elements on a few of these. So our menu ID is up here somewhere. Let's see, where are we at? Right here. So we have our image ID of menu. So this is basically allowing us to target that element and be able to reference it as this menu variable, a variable called menu here in our JavaScript. So we need a couple more. We need our nav element, get element by ID of nav. So we have another one called nav up there. And then also exit, which is the exit button on the mobile navigation. And that's called exit. So these don't do anything in and of themselves. It just kind of just gains access to them so that we can do something with them. So what we're going to do is on the menu, which is in relation to this icon right here, we're going to say menu dot add event listener, and it accepts a certain type of event. So it could be hovers or anything like that. This is a click event. So when somebody clicks on it, we're going to make something happen. So we're going to pass in a function with E as a parameter, and you'll see how we work in with that. And then we open up things in the squiggly bracket. It's similar sort of to CSS. And so when something clicks, do something in here. So we could do alert, I have been clicked. So if we do that, watch what happens. We have this dialog that pops up and says, I have been clicked. Okay, great. We don't want that though. So what we want to do instead is use our nav variable defined right here. We'll say nav dot class list dot toggle a class called a CSS class called hide mobile. All right, so what this will do when we do it is it will attach and detach that hide mobile class. And the mobile class is defined in our CSS, so hide mobile of display none. So it will remove hide mobile if it exists on the nav element right here, if that makes any sense. And then also we're going to do E dot, and E, by the way, is passed in right there, prevent default. And what that does is when if you were to click this and you were to scroll down, it would kind of go up, the browser would go up, and you don't want that. So we're going to take this same code here real quickly, and I'm going to put in exit, in which that's this button. Nothing happens right now when you click on it, and it's basically going to be very similar, except it's going to be nav class list dot add, and this type is just going to add hide mobile. All right, so now if we click it and then click this, there we go. It works as it should. And this will still work as well. So even if we click that and then come back, it still shows up and it changes its style automatically very quickly. And there we go. Boy, that was lengthy. So yeah, there we go. This is the app or the website that we designed all the way from the course from a couple days ago, or last week rather, and realizing it in the browser. And you can check this out on your phones and everything, and it should work quite well. All right, hopefully you stuck with me till the end here, and you've learned a massive amount. So going forward, if that was your first go around at front-end development, just try to get more practice by creating pages, maybe taking existing UI designs and trying to make them a reality with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't yet, and I will see you guys very shortly. Goodbye.